All right, so I guess what I'll do in terms of questions, Captain Hickman, maybe you can give me some guidance on this. Would it be best if I just periodically ask if folks have questions, or should they feel free to just kind of ask as they need?
So for business practices, and I should have laid this on, so excuse me. Let's go ahead. If you have a question, you can type it in the chat. And then from there, Mr. Mason, you can see them. Either you can raise your hand in the chat, or you can just type your question in the chat to not interrupt you. And then from there, you can respond to that question. I think that'd probably be the best way. That's what I think.
Cool. All right. Is there a way to see the chat while I'm in the share screen mode?
Okay, I understand. Yeah, so I can see the chat. I don't think you'll be able to see it. So you probably just have to periodically ask the questions. If somebody does have a question, you just have to have a tactical insertion of your question while Mr. Mason is has a pause in his speaking, and then you can ask from there. That'd probably be the best ways of going about it.
Okay. Cool. What I did is I got out of the share screen and just opened up the chat. So I'll come back here periodically just to make sure.
Okay.
All right, great. Let's go ahead and share that again. All right, so yeah, hopefully now everybody can see the free writing slide here. Again, the point of this is not just to ramble on about writing process. This is going to be a tool that will be really helpful for you guys when it does come time to write these papers. You're going to have to write an argument paper. You're going to have to write a 6 to 8 page mission command essay, and you're going to, for that last essay I mentioned, you're going to have to be doing some significant research. You're going to be reading books. And then you're going to get done and you're going to be like, what do I think about all this material? Wait, what was that book about? So something like free writing can be a really valuable technique because it helps you, it forces you to figure out, what did I think about this book? What are my thoughts about this book in terms of ADP 6-0 and that doctrine? So the point here with this exercise that we're going to do is to expose you to free writing so that you'll have that as a tool in your toolbox to eliminate writer's block. This is without question the most popular and most universally useful technique for defeating writer's block. So it forces you to write without stopping for about 7 to 10 minute block is the traditional guidance, but you can go as long as you want. But the good thing, and this is what makes it unique and perhaps most important, aside from not stopping for that entire time, is you don't need to concern yourself with spelling, grammar, or punctuation. This is not some sort of technique for generating a finished product. It's the goal, again, is to generate as much as you can about a certain topic in the shortest amount of time possible. So in that sense, it's an efficient method for getting your thoughts out. The idea is to get used to that feeling of articulating the ideas on the page. So as we go about our day-to-day lives and, we have thoughts about things, we might have opinions on certain topics, but our brains tend to be very forgiving in making these logical leaps that don't necessarily make sense, that may contain logical fallacies. So when we translate our thoughts, our feelings, whatever the case may be, into actual language, because we don't always think in full sentences, right? That forces us to take a closer look at what it is that we think. And furthermore, free writing helps us to discover things we may not have recognized that we, thought, subconscious thoughts. So it's a really powerful technique that if you do any amount of research into it, you can see a lot of people are creative individuals are into this technique, and there's a good reason why. So what we're going to do today is just a quick practical exercise, and you're not going to have to turn this in or even, share the stuff that you've written. Again, this is the type of writing that you do for yourself to generate ideas, but we're going to get some experience, number one, with free writing, but also to get into the mindset of problem solving, identifying problems and coming up with solutions. That's going to be a huge part of your argument essay, which we'll hear about later. So what we're going to reflect on this morning is your own communication experience in the Army. So this is all you're going to have to do. And there's no right or wrong answers. And again, you're not going to have to share this writing. Just identify a problem that you feel you recognize in Army working environments. And you're going to reflect on this problem in your writing. So you can maybe begin by making a numbered list of problems that you've noticed. Or if you maybe have a pet peeve about writing or verbal communication in the Army, just begin with that. And you want to identify a problem in this rewriting exercise, but then from there you're going to start to develop, number 2 on the slide here, at least one idea to help solve this problem. So you're going to think of your writing as brainstorming towards an informal proposal for change. Again, this is not the type of writing or proposal that you'd share with an audience. It's for you to develop your ideas. So if you get stuck while you're doing this, again, you're really not supposed to stop, but if you need to, look at this 3rd bullet point. These are some additional prompts to keep your thoughts going. Would your solution actually work? If you want to go with that, that would be a good stone. How can you prove that the solution would work? What kind of resources would be necessary to make your solution feasible? Funding, for example, and implementing your solution. Make a list. So this is the kind of writing that will help you to generate ideas in the future for other topics. But for now, let's go ahead and take about 7 minutes to do this exercise. And again, there really is no requirement other than sitting and writing without. I'm going to go ahead and set a timer. Does anyone have any questions on this particular exercise before we get started? Let's go ahead and wrap up that thought. So here's the bottom line with free writing and writing in general. You can think of free writing as your PT for writing. Writing is, obviously there are some people where writing comes more naturally. There are folks who are more naturally gifted, just like basketball or, running or anything. But however, just like anything else, as with anything else, writing, you only get better by actually doing the damn thing, right? So my recommendation to you all is, in this course, make a habit of writing and reading regularly. So let's just say, if in terms of starting a PT program for writing and one for reading as well, the reading side, just buy a book that maybe you're a regular reader. Again, everyone's different, but if you're not already reading regularly, go ahead and buy a book that is interesting to you. It doesn't need to be about anything related to this class, and make sure you read a little bit before bed every night, because reading, studies show that is a huge help for those who want to improve their writing. Just looking at the style of writing that others use, it's going to help your vocabulary. It'll help you to understand proper grammar better, but also in terms of becoming a better writer, you also just need to do it regularly. Think of it again, exercises like free writing, like the cardio of your PT, where it's like maybe you don't feel like doing it, but you do it. You have to just do it anyway. Get on that Echo bike or get on that treadmill and get the cardio in, and you always will feel better after it. And in this case with writing, this is again a tool that you can use towards generating ideas for your assignments in this course. So does anybody have any thoughts they want to share about that exercise? Had anyone used that technique before? Any general thoughts? I know it might be tricky in terms of figuring out how participation will work in the online environment. I'm going to pull up the chat too, but you can feel free to use your microphone at first. We're going to learn as we go here. In general, how did that exercise feel?
So this is Lieutenant Bentley. Something I can speak on it is that's actually typically how I like to begin all my papers for my writing. It's essentially just getting individual paragraphs on putting my ideas on paper, whether it makes perfect sense and is good grammar or not. Then I'll typically go back through after getting all my ideas and the main points that I want to make for my paper to then kind of refine that into proper grammar or better ideas or references maybe to support what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. That is a picture-perfect example or description of how we want to approach the writing process, is that it's okay to start with a relative mess, right? So that really is a good lead into our next slide in terms of how, order of operations, so to speak. Order of operations is to start by making a mess, essentially, with just like Lieutenant Bentley was talking about, when we've got free writing, or we maybe are making like these sort of brief paragraphs, or maybe there are no paragraphs at all, but then we go back and refine it. So here's the deal. Let's look at free writing again as a step. Remember, we looked at those steps in the writing process. Also, as a student mentioned before, research comes into play at a certain point in the writing process. So the first step is to do things like free writing and also read about your topic, right? So we need to start with those things, and then we can move on for refining. But what's the value of step one being a technique like free writing? Here we can see some key takeaways. Free writing is a temporary suspension of self-judgment, revision, and criticism, right? That should come later, just as we talked about a moment ago. And this is not some woo-woo thing. It literally is part of the creative part of your brain to make sure that you turn that critic off in your mind for the time being. Otherwise, you will freeze up and you won't be able to explore the thoughts that you have in your head. So for this time being, the point number two, it doesn't matter if your grammar is jacked up. You shouldn't even be thinking about that. Doesn't matter if all you're doing is making a list of possible ideas. Also, another great way to approach the beginning of a writing project is to make a list of questions. Writing lists of questions, that's a great way to figure out what you don't know and what you'd like to know about a topic. And when you find answers to those questions, you'll be generating original thought that is sometimes seemingly so elusive and difficult to find when we're racking our brains for ideas or analysis on a given topic. So as hopefully you can see, a lot of this sort of these steps apply to problem solving for courses of action in general, not just writing, right? This is about generating ideas, period. So number four, free writing is great because it's also, you want to keep in mind what's important is that you're getting some thinking done on the page. This initial self-criticism is going to get in the way of your generating ideas. So free writing, as the name suggests, gives us a chance to be free of that self-judgment. Now, that being said, this is where the reality comes in. It's like, last but not least, you're certainly going to apply that judgment later in the writing process, right? Your thoughts, your feelings are not necessarily correct. They're going to have to be tested and refined by things like research, as was just mentioned before. You're not going to need to back up your opinions with evidence from credible sources. And we're going to be talking a lot about that in just a minute. So the intent of this whole section of the block of instruction is just, again, to expose you to free writing as a tool that can help. If you didn't find it helpful, I know that some folks who are kind of perfectionists, they really dislike the act of writing a sentence that might have misspellings or any grammatical issues. They get distracted by that. My advice would be to keep practicing and try to get over that. But if you really can't, there are other techniques that are that are also free writing. Again, we're talking about things you do before drafting, like informal outlining, just making lists of ideas, things like that. So be sure to explore and find a technique that works for you. But hopefully you found free writing to be useful. And I hope that you will use it in the future. I hope that you'll consider making a habit of writing, maybe keeping a really, concise journal where you set aside just 10 minutes to write every night before bed, to maybe reflect on what's going on in the course. You can do whatever the hell you want, really, in terms of what you write about. You can list your frustrations. You can make a list of your key takeaways. Whatever the case may be, making a habit of writing regularly, or you can do creative writing if you're interested in creative writing. Just getting into the habit of writing will make a huge difference, because writing is like anything else. You're only going to get better at it by actually doing the thing. So, all right, let's dive into the next section of the course. This is where we're going to take a look at this should be of interest to you. We're taking a look at the Army Standard of Writing, and most specifically, where we're going here is I'm going to demonstrate how the Army Standard, the keys from the standards set forth in AR 25-50, they directly track to the grading rubrics that we have for these assignments. But I am very confident that I'm going to be able to deliver and explain how they're connected in a way that makes sense, so that it's going to relieve a lot of anxiety on your part, where you're like, oh, okay, I get it. This is what we're going to be evaluated on. It's essentially 4 main categories, and I just need to make sure I have everything dialed in terms of these categories, and that's how I'm going to earn points, right? It's not one thing that's important when you look at these rubrics for grading is that you don't start at 100% and then lose points. You start at 0 and you earn points for meeting the exceptional side of that rubric. So I believe you all already have the writing resources folder. If you don't worry, your SGL will be forwarding that out to you. But I think it already has been forwarded to you. It's got all of the essential materials that you'll need for this course. Myself and Mr. Stacy were the 2 writing instructors here. You'll be working with me. We each get assigned different teams, but we've put that folder together to be as concise and useful as possible, so it doesn't have a bunch of fluff in it. It's all stuff that is there to make your life easier getting through these assignments and to make your writing better. So we put a lot of work into that folder, so that really what you want to do is save that folder to your desktop so that you don't have to rely on going to Blackboard, because technology issues happen, right? So having it on your desktop, you'll be able to access everything you need there. But again, tying this back to what you see on the slide now, we're gonna see that the Army Standard for effective writing, the rubrics are essentially, they have their foundation in this definition. And the cool thing about the Army Standard for writing is that it's very simple, doctrinally speaking, which is a good thing. And a lot of these principles of effective writing, as per the Army Standard, are applicable to professional and academic writing. Now, I know there are some of you out there that might have a bad taste in your mouth about Army writing, and I've heard a lot of stories about, commanders who had, idiosyncratic requirements for memos or things like that perhaps weren't even based in doctrine, so that can be really frustrating. But guess what? You guys are on your way to becoming the commanders of the future, so hopefully you can create a new generation of command where you are instituting reasonable writing expectations, where you're not going to confuse and frustrate those under you. So let's take a look at this useful definition of effective writing, the Army Standard. It's easily understood by the reader in a single rapid reading. That's key point number 1. And it's free from errors in the following 4 categories. This is where it becomes really important: substance, organization, style, and correctness. Now that might sound like jargon, but we're going to demystify those 4 categories because they are important terms. And they all mean something specific that we'll be able to clearly understand by the end of this presentation. But the key takeaway, again, is you want your writing to be understandable in a single rapid reading. Obviously, if you're operating in an environment that has a high tempo, things should be easy to read. They should be clear, concise. So we're going to take a look at 3 of the key principles from AR 25-50 that will be important for this class, this type of writing. And it's important to note that AR 2550, as you probably know, it's very heavy on templates and formatting. It doesn't have a whole heck of a lot on style. But we're going to highlight the things that are important in that piece of doctrine about style, to include the 3 C's, making sure your writing is clear, concise, and correct. Number 2, bluff. Bottom line up front. This is an important concept that you're all very familiar, I'm sure, in terms of like making your main point first thing or early on in a piece of writing. How do these concepts apply to the written assignments we'll be doing? We're going to investigate that. And last but not least, active voice and passive voice. As you probably know, we almost always want to use active voice. It makes for stronger, more concise writing. And we'll look at some simple examples that help demonstrate not only what passive voice is, but why it's problematic, as well as the flip side of that coin, what active voice looks like and why it can make for stronger sentences, stronger writing. So we've got a sentence here that we're going to use as a sample, and I'll go ahead and read it out loud. And we want to reflect on this sentence in terms of the idea of being clear, concise, and correct. So just listen to this sentence with an open mind and give me your honest impression. Within that culture, members of the profession create a soldier's identity with a sense of calling and ownership over the advancement of the profession and the exemplary performance of its members, and serve in a bonded unity of fellow professionals with a shared sense of calling. What's your take on that sentence? Just first blush, honest opinion. Do you feel like that is a sentence that's easy to understand on a single rapid reading or on a first listen?
It's not even clear and concise. It's a lot of words.
Right, exactly. It's not clear. It's not particularly concise, and there are some issues with correctness. We've got some misused commas here and there. The one before "and" in particular is incorrect. So the main takeaway here is that this is a good example of the type of sentence we generally want to avoid. Now, I'm sure you've come across writing like this, and you might feel like, oh, well, this sounds like it's academic. This is not good academic writing. Good academic writing is clear, concise, and correct for the intended audience, right? So let's analyze. What can we take away? What are some key takeaways from this sentence? Number 1, we can see that it's 46 words. No one is going to be counting how many words are in your sentences, right? It's okay sometimes to have longer sentences, but you still want to be concise in terms of delivering meaning. And so it's interesting to note that as per Army standard, particularly when you're working in doctrinal formats, you want to try to stick to about 15 words per sentence. It's okay to go over or under a little bit, but you want to avoid sentences that are lacking in clarity, concision, or correctness. So that's just a simple key concept. And my key takeaway here, what is the best way to make sure that your writing is clear, concise, and correct? The best technique is also one of the most simple. Read your writing out loud. When you do that, what you do is all of a sudden you are enhancing your experience of what you've written. So when we're typing and writing, essentially what we're doing is, we're using our fingers to generate words on the screen, and our eyes are just scanning, right? So when we go through that process, it's really easy for us to miss words where it's like, oh, I forgot to include this here or that there. But ultimately, when we read something out loud, we're using our eyes to read. Obviously, we're using our mouth to enunciate those words, and we're also using, most importantly, perhaps our ears, because we may not write all the time, but we speak and we listen all the time. If you read your writing and something sounds wrong, it probably is suffering from an issue of clarity concision, or correctness. So just remember, like, jot this down. Key takeaway number 1 is before you turn something in, take the time to read it out loud. It's the best bang for your buck in terms of improving your clarity, your concision, and your correctness with your writing. But that's just a general key concept that we want to take away from AR 25-50. That's particularly relevant for the 3 written assignments you'll do in this course. The next key concept from AR 25-50 is bluffed. This is that simple bottom line up front. Again, this is a good concept in general. I think that the civilian sector could really benefit from a good dose of this, right? Like, bottom line up front, what's your point? You know, like, that's something that is often lost in this day and age. But with good argumentative writing, good professional writing, we should understand what the main point is pretty soon in the piece of writing. So let's go ahead and demystify this in terms of the practical application of this for your written assignments. Right now on the screen, you'll see something very important and relevant to you. On the left-hand side right there, you'll see information paper, that little document there. That's just a quick visual representation of what your first assignment is. It's called an information paper, and it's a doctrinally based document. I don't know if you've written an information paper before. You know, I never can tell. Sometimes I'll ask a section like, hey, how many people have been required to do an information paper before? And sometimes I'll see lots of hands, and sometimes I'll see none at all. So I know that maybe there are some of you who have done an information paper before, but it's a really useful doctrinal format in order to just get information across in a way, much like a memo. You can tell just by looking at that small screenshot. It's very similar to a memo, but it's based on the TR 1-11, which you'll find an example of in your writing resources folder. You'll find 2 samples actually, and the samples actually describe how to write an information paper. But the point for us now here is that we can see that the way that bottom line up front works for an information paper is that you put your most important point not first. You know, you can see, if you look carefully at that little document, you can see the first thing is actually the date. Then the next thing is the format of what you're writing, and that's called information paper. That's actually part of the format, is to write information paper. Then you'd have your subject and your purpose, and then your bluff. Your bottom line up front would be the first fact that you list. More to follow on this, so if you don't totally understand this information paper right now, that's understandable. We haven't really delved into it, but the point is that bottom line up front does apply to this piece of writing that you'll do, and more on that to follow. But the next thing that we see here is what represents the essay format, right? And those are your other 2 written assignments. That's your argument paper, that's your mission command paper, and you can see that there's an arrow pointing to a sentence at the end of the first paragraph. Can anyone tell us what that arrow is pointing to? What's that last sentence in our first paragraph going to be for an essay?
The thesis?
Exactly. That's going to be our thesis statement. We're going to talk more about thesis statements, but for those, again, I want everyone to remember that folks are at different stages in terms of the degree programs they've done, whereas, like, well, obviously that's a thesis, but if it wasn't obvious to you, don't worry. We're still going to make it clear and demystify what a thesis statement is, what they should look like for these assignments, and why they're important for effective argumentative writing, not only in the academic realm, but in the professional workplace as well. So, what do we think about this sentence here? Who can identify the issue with this sentence? Dinner is being eaten by Sergeant Jones.
It's passive.
Passive.
Exactly. We've got a passive voice construction. Dinner is being eaten by Sergeant Jones. Now, obviously, this is kind of a ridiculous example in the sense that it's very basic, but looking at these basic examples is helpful in terms of learning and analyzing the mechanics of what's happening here. So when we translate this passive voice construction into active voice, we can see Sergeant Jones is eating dinner, right? It's much clearer. And we can also see if we analyze the number of words in the sentence, we can see that we've gone from 8 words to 5 words. So not only is it more clear, it's more concise and more correct ultimately. So all 3 of these key principles from AR 25-50, again, clear, concise, correct, bottom line up front, passive voice, active voice, they are all interrelated. We can see already how this is more clear, more concise, more correct, but it also kind of follows the bluff concept in the sense that the person that's doing the action comes first in the sentence. So Sergeant Jones is eating dinner rather than the dinner is being eaten by Sergeant Jones. So it's really kind of cool to see how these things are interrelated. So we can see a little bit about why passive voice is clunky, and it's not as clear, it's not as concise, not as correct. But what's on the flip side of that coin? Active voice. What makes active voice good? Well, number one, it emphasizes the actor of the sentence. It shows who or what is doing the action in the sentence by putting the actor before the verb. So in that sense, it's assigning responsibility, which is particularly important in the Army, right? Because we want accountability. Who is doing a certain action? We want that to be first in the sentence. We're going to see how with the passive voice, it can be dangerous to use passive voice because we can lose the responsible party when we use passive voice. Oftentimes, you'll see politicians use passive voice to avoid responsibility. Here's a simple example. A mistake was made and, this catastrophe happened. So a mistake was made. Well, what's missing there? Who made the mistake? So, that's just a quick and dirty example of how passive voice can be manipulative. It can also be downright dangerous when it comes to the type of writing that you all will be doing as military professionals. So number 3, obviously active voice creates shorter sentences too. So that's why active voice gets driven home so hard in AR 25-50, and it is definitely something we want to keep in mind as we do our written assignments in this course. So I promise this is as technical as we'll get with grammar, but we want to make sure, and this is something that comes up every term for some reason. I understand sometimes these things can be confusing. It's probably been a while since you've looked at grammar. Passive voice and past tense, 2 totally different things. Passive voice is a voice. It's a style of the organization of subject and verb form. It's not about past tense. With mission command, for example, you're going to be writing about a conflict that already happened. You can use past tense. You should use past tense. Passive voice is something different entirely. And let's look at what that is. At the most technical level, the way to recognize passive voice is you're going to have a form of the to be verb, N is, are, was, were, be, being, been, plus a past participle of the verb. That's just a verb form that ends in ed or en. So I think that's where the confusion comes in with passive voice and past tense. They are different things. So again, if we want that simple example, we can see dinner is being, that's the form of to be, eaten by Sergeant Jones. So that's passive voice. Now, for those who leave this particular block of instruction with questions on active and passive voice, I want you to rest assured that you've got more resources. Number 1, in the English Writing Resources folder that you'll have, hopefully you already have it, you'll see that there's a document entitled Grammar Help Links. That's just a Word document that I put together that has a list of helpful links for common problems that I've seen in grading these papers. And eventually, after teaching here after the first 6 months or so, I got the bright idea where I was like, okay, what if I took the most common problems that I see when grading? Because when I grade digitally, and I'll always give a link where it's like, hey, you're having problems with commas, here's a helpful link. What if I gave these links to students ahead of time? And there's only like 5 or 6 of these common problems, whether it's semicolons, active voice, whatever. That way you could have a quick grammar tune-up so that you don't have to learn the hard way by getting dinged for any grammatical issues. So there's a great article on active and passive voice in the English Writing Resources folder. So be sure to check that out. It's in the Word document, Grammar Help Links. So any questions so far? Just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions. All right, great. Not seeing anything in the chats. All right, excellent. So a quick look now at passive voice and active voice. Now, the Confederacy was defeated by the Union Army 1865. A simple sentence where we can see was defeated, right? That is clearly passive voice. Who wants to take a crack at making that an active voice construction?
The Confederacy defeated the Union Army in 1865.
Well, very close. You would say the Union Army defeated the Confederacy. Otherwise, you'd be changing history in a dramatic way, right?
Backwards, my bad.
That's okay. But hey, here's the good news: it was definitely an active voice construction. That's really all that matters. So you got the important part right there. So yes, the Union Army defeated the Confederacy in 1865. So we've put the actor of the sentence up front. Now here, let me demonstrate where passive voice, as I mentioned before, can be dangerous at times in terms of omitting key information. What if this passive sentence simply read, "The Confederacy was defeated in 1865"? What would we have lost?
The subject.
Exactly. We've lost the subject. We've lost responsibility. Now we all are familiar with, the Civil War. But what if we're not from this country? What if we're talking about a more specific battle that you're covering in Mission Command, where you're really getting into the weeds of a specific conflict, where it's maybe not clear which group defeated the other group, or which segment of the group defeated the other group. So this really drives home the importance of active voice and active writing. So how about this one? It has been said by General Dempsey that the moral legitimacy to use deadly force is rooted in a respect for basic human rights. Anybody want to try to translate that into active voice?
Don't you just take away the has been? Like you omit that from the sentence?
That's part of it. But then how would you have the full sentence read from there if we lost has been? Who's the subject here?
Wouldn't you just say,
So,
he said that the moral legitimacy to use deadly force is rooted in a respect for basic human rights?
Exactly. So you both have it here. It's like it has been. That's really not helping the sentence here. And in terms of what's passive here, it's been said, right? So we got that form of to be plus the past participle said. But ultimately, we want General Dempsey up front, so it should be General Dempsey said, right? So it makes it much simpler. However, there is this myth here that we have to avoid all passive voice. So let's take a look. Once this is corrected into active voice, we've got General Dempsey said that the moral legitimacy to use deadly force is rooted. That's a form of to be and a past participle, right? That's an example of passive voice that's okay. Now, this is something that takes practice, and it's best to err on the side of always using active voice. But when we look at that phrase is rooted, this is an idiomatic phrase in the English language where if we tried to correct it to active voice, it would look something like has its roots in or roots in. Like that doesn't make sense, right? So that's an idiomatic phrase that is passive voice by nature. So that would be an example where using a passive construction is okay. So the key takeaway is that your standard is to be predominantly an active voice. So again, you've got a few steps here, and I'm going to give you your key takeaway number 2 in just a second, so tune in. You want to identify passive voice by finding the verb form to be plus a past participle. You want to ask who or what is responsible for the action in that sentence. Put it up front. Put the answer to that question up front. All right, so my key takeaway here is that this is a lot to learn in a short amount of time, and I know that writing is just one of the things that you guys have to do in this curriculum. So my advice would be use technology to your advantage, and here's how you can do it. With Microsoft Word, it depends on whether you're using a Mac or a PC, which version of Word you have. Take the time out to find that information out based on whether you have a Mac or a PC, which version of Word you have, and do a Google search on how to engage the passive voice tracker. Because I believe by default, the sort of grammar check for Word is default enabled. But you can go one step further to check a box where it will identify all instances of passive voice and underline them. So at least then you will have identified the target, so to speak, with passive voice, and you can then translate that into active voice. Number 2, something that I've seen a lot of students starting to use is Grammarly. Do I frown on that? Absolutely not. It's a learning tool. It's not making your life easier in the sense that it's doing writing for you. It's giving you suggestions as to ways that you can improve your writing. And ultimately, I view that as a learning tool. So I'm not a Luddite. I am someone that thinks you should embrace technology as long as you're not using it to be academically dishonest. If you're using a tool like Grammarly or Microsoft Word Grammar Check to help yourself learn about how to write effectively, by all means, use technology to your advantage. All right, so we've covered these 3 key concepts from AR 25-50, and this is where we're going to back up to this definition of effective writing. Easily understood by the reader in a single rapid reading. Free of errors in what? Again, this is where it gets really important. These 4 categories are the 4 categories that are going to be most important to you if you're concerned about your grades for the assignments, because they are the 4 categories of the rubric: substance, style, organization, and correctness. So you can see there a little graphic. This is approximately what your rubrics will look like. This is an older one, but it's still just as relevant. You can see that it's divided up into substance, organization, style, and correctness. So the next section of our block of instruction here is going to be to understand these 4 categories of the rubric that have their foundation, again, in the definition of effective writing as per AR 25-50. And again, the cool thing is that this definition of effective writing that the Army puts forth is really applicable to so many different kinds of writing. That this is not just kind of going through hoops and doing the exercises that the Army's making me do. You really should view this as an opportunity to tune up your writing skills, specifically your persuasive writing skills, which are inarguably important for your job and for your future profession if you're going to be doing a master's and moving on to something else. But I've had students come up to me and say, hey, the way that you break down things like paragraph organization and these 4 categories of the rubric, they were so helpful for me in terms of the GRE, which you're going to be required to take. Or I've had a student come up to me about his master's program who was struggling with writing. And this was after he had already finished the course. I actually ran into him in the bathroom. He was like, hey, Mr. Mason. And I have so many students, I didn't recognize him at the time, but he was just saying how he was really struggling with his papers, but once he employed these techniques, all of a sudden he was getting A's on his papers in his master's degree. So I don't want to sound like a salesman. This is just the facts. I didn't make this stuff up. This all of this stuff represents the key fundamentals for effective writing. So let's take a closer look at these categories from the rubric so we really understand the anatomy of argument and effective writing. The first category of the rubric, and arguably the most important, is called substance. This just means essentially the whole. Imagine the last paper that you wrote in college, especially if it were an argumentative paper. Imagine that paper as a whole. Consider that the substance of your writing. And the key thing with substance is that we can divide substance into two main categories, and it's really important that we understand these categories: evidence and analysis. So if you imagine a paper that you've written, odds are you had evidence and you had analysis, right? And that's probably all that you had in the paper. So that would make up the whole or the substance of your writing. Now, who can tell me, in other words, what evidence is? Where do we get evidence? What would constitute evidence?
This is Captain Conway. I would say evidence would just be based off your analysis, any books or quotes, any type of publication that can back your findings, your facts and findings.
100%. Very well put. That is exactly what evidence is. We can essentially think of evidence as...
So...
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is Kathy. So you're talking about like citing sources, right?
Yes, more so the incorporation of source material, but citing those sources is also equally important.
Okay.
Right. So for right now, we're talking about what's actually in the paper. But yes, when you bring sources in, you definitely need to give citation for those sources. And that's just basically, we're going to be going deeper into how we will cite our sources just a little later. But for now, the key thing is to make this demarcation that was so well put before, where evidence, we can just think of it as our source material. These are the books that we find, the articles that we find that are going to support and give credibility to our opinion on a topic. For our proposed course of action, right? Like if you are going to make a proposed course of action, you should probably have some credible source material to back it up. Otherwise, people will just be like, hey, that's your opinion. But opinion gets elevated to what we call analysis when it's supported by credible evidence. So we can see here on the screen now, we've got evidence and analysis. With evidence, some key terms for the rubric: we want our sources to be credible. So that means we want accurate, detailed, wherever possible, quantitative evidence, statistics. That's what we mean there. Quantitative numbers can be persuasive, relevant to the topic at hand, and also documented. And that relates to the last question we had, right? We do need to document our evidence, right? We need to give citations and let our readers know where the source came from. At the same time, documented has another meaning. Can anybody think of what we might, the second meaning might mean in terms of evidence and documentation? Another relationship that evidence and documentation might have? It's a trickier one. What I'm getting at is simply that a lot of the best evidence, a lot of the best sources will have their sources documented, right? So a lot of credible source material, they're also going to follow the same advice, and they're going to have sources to back up their claims. So that's one thing we can look at for whether or not a source is credible, is do they have their own references documented? And one quick look ahead here is if you find a good source on your topic, you can use this technique that makes your life easier called swimming upstream, where you can look at the sources that author used and investigate those sources as possible sources for yourself. So that's evidence or source material. On the other side of this, we have analysis. This is our original thinking, right? This is our argument, essentially. And we can also think of the key terms of analysis. We want our thinking and our writing to be insightful. How do we get there? By doing things like free writing and coming up with original, insightful ideas about a topic. Our analysis should consider alternative points of view. That doesn't mean that we embrace those points of view, right? That would weaken our argument if we're like, well, this is the course of action I recommend. Now, some people might say we should take this course of action and then leave it. You've left your readers or your audience confused as to, wait a second, well, this other alternative point of view they mentioned sounds pretty good too. Why shouldn't we do that? Well, that's why when in your analysis, when you consider alternative points of view, you also need to refute those points of view and still argue for why your course of action is the best one to take. And then last but not least, you'll see that analysis is supported. Now, what do you guys think that means? What is analysis supported by? I hear some static, but I don't hear any talking.
Studies, maybe?
Yeah, that in a sense, yes, it could be studies, but ultimately studies would be a type of what?
Evidence?
Exactly.
Researches.
Exactly, research.
Proven.
So our analysis needs to be supported by evidence. So now we see this relationship, right? Hopefully now it's really clear. The basic building block of a strong paragraph, because when we really boil down the essence of a piece of writing, it boils down to those body paragraphs. We know we have an introduction and conclusion. We'll look at those later, but it's really important that we recognize that the big substance of writing is at the paragraph level, and it's going to be a healthy blend, about 50-50, of evidence from outside sources and us unpacking that evidence and explaining insightfully how that evidence supports our claim. So there's going to be a lot more on this when we talk about paragraph organization. But for now, the key thing to take away is that one of the categories on the rubric is substance. So for your essays, you need to have strong source material and you need to have strong analysis of that source material. How does that source material support the point that you're trying to make? So any questions so far? If not, I'll move on to the types of sources, and I'll discuss why this is important. This is not just for blathering on about writing-related topics. This has practical importance for you with your essays. Generally speaking, there are two types of sources. There are primary sources. These are first-hand, raw, original materials. Historical documents, journals, letters. You can consider this like straight from the horse's mouth type of source material. Then we also have secondary sources, and these are sources that we're probably very familiar with that are analytical, interpretive studies, or evaluative works that often use primary sources to make their point. So just a quick and dirty example of this is, let's say that you're an English major and you've got a copy of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. That's the original book. So what kind of source would that be considered?
Primary.
Exactly. That would be a primary source. So now we can imagine thousands upon thousands of secondary sources where English scholars have written about, say, tragedy in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. So that's an example of primary and secondary. Now, in your own mind, think about what you're interested in not just for this course, but just in general, your past field of study for your undergrad. You might be in a master's program now. Think of a topic you're interested in and swap out Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet for something that is a primary source, and then imagine that, whoa, there's going to be thousands of secondary sources that are based on this primary document. So this becomes more important for the mission command paper as well as the argumentative essay. And we'll talk more about this in the workshop. I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but there will be workshops coming up. I'll give you the dates in just a little bit, but we're going to have a workshop on the argument essay. This will come up again. And also for the mission command essay, we'll have a workshop where they're basically going to be about 40-minute lessons where everybody will have the opportunity to ask questions about the specific assignment, because I know I'm throwing a lot at you today for this block of instruction. So those are the two types, general categories of sources. The key takeaway here is that it's valuable to use both. Find primary sources and also use secondary sources. They're both really valuable. Now, scholarly sources. Usually if this is a live class, I'll ask how many students by a show of hands have been required to use scholarly sources in the past. Obviously, we can't quite do that here, but from my past knowledge, I'm going to guarantee that most of you have probably been required to use what we call scholarly sources before. Now, I like to make things practical as practical as possible. Why do we care about scholarly sources for this class? I'll tell you why you should care. It's because with the mission command paper, you have to have at least 4 scholarly sources. You can use other types of sources, but scholarly sources are, by definition, they're always secondary. They're always analytical, interpretive, evaluative works, right? But the thing about scholarly sources as a type of secondary source is that they are often articles that are peer-reviewed by experts in the field. They often appear in academic or professional journals rather than traditional magazines or websites, and they go through a greater vetting process before they're published. So, but you can also use books as your scholarly sources, and all you need to do is ask. You don't have to answer yes to all of these questions, just one of the 3. Is the book published by a university press? If so, you're good to go. Is the author professionally or academically credentialed? If yes, you're good to go. For your purposes, with the mission command paper, that's the only paper where you're required to have scholarly sources. As long as you're dealing with a book that's written by a noted military historian, then you're good to go for this course. And number 3, does the book have thorough references? If your author is referencing other credible sources, for our purposes, that would be considered a scholarly source. Now, what's now irrelevant, and I should have deleted from the slide deck since we are obviously in the midst of a pandemic, normally your go-to would be John at the ALU library, and my advice is usually to go straight to him because he can help save you time in finding sources because he really knows his stuff. His guidance is to use this particular link where you can find sources. Also, Google Scholar is helpful. So we're going to continue to work on making sure that you guys have access to scholarly sources and books that you'll need to write your essay. Now, can someone tell me, have you guys already chosen your mission command battles?
Yes, we have.
Okay, great. So my advice is to get on top of just finding some general books on the conflict that you're covering or your books on the commander that you're covering, and start reading them. That could be part of your reading PT program.
I know you want to go on a walk.
So now this is another thing that you don't need to fully understand right now in this block of instruction. There's a copy of this in your writing resources folder. This is simply a flowchart that can help guide you when you find what's on the left side, when you find an article, when you find a book, when you find something that doesn't really seem to be an article or a book. That's where this flowchart can be most helpful. For example, if we look at the other column, is it doctrine? Is it an interview or video? You just go through and answer yes or no, and eventually it will lead you to what source type it is. But obviously, if you have a question, you can always contact me. As I mentioned up front here, I am a resource for you. My goal is for your success in the course. All right, so we've covered substance. That's the most important, and it bears the most points for you in terms of all of your written assignments, and that's making sure that the actual content of your writing is strong. Now, beyond that, the next category of the rubric, and again, this all tracks back to the definition of effective Army writing, these 4 categories, is organization. So, at this point, let's go ahead and take a 5-minute bathroom break, and we'll come right back. All right, so how's everybody feeling so far? Any questions? Did I miss any questions? By the way, don't be afraid to accidentally interrupt me. I know we're all learning as we go here in terms of using Teams to do these seminars. And just know, again, I'm there's a lot to cover in this block of instruction. Just keep in mind that there's going to be 2 additional workshops, as I mentioned, that are going to cover the most important papers for this course, where you'll have plenty of time to ask questions. Also, I'm going to have office hours every day of the week starting on Monday. It is Friday today, right? I mean, am I the only one that's lost track of the days? I'm sure not. Yeah, it's Friday. So starting on Monday, I'm going to have office hours from 11 to 1300. And I'll talk more about how we're going to run those a little later on. But we're going to learn as we go and figure out what works best. But certainly you'll have email as an option. I'm going to use Teams and or Zoom. I think Zoom might be easier for our particular purposes with office hours. But you're going to be able to make an appointment with me to talk on the phone about your questions. We can look at your paper. But just to give you some reassurance, if you're feeling like, wow, we're covering a whole bunch of stuff really fast, you'll also have access to this block of instruction in your writing resources folder. Did you guys already get the writing resources folder?
Cadre, that's you.
Okay, looks like yes. Okay, good. Sorry, the chat had closed on me.
Hey, I had a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, you already got it, I'm sure.
So as far as the clear and concise communication, I was going to ask you to cover colloquials or being too conversational during your writing, and if that's like something we should be away from.
Oh, using colloquialisms in your writing?
Yes.
Well, what's sort of an example of what you mean by that? I mean, you know, being too informal is something we generally want to avoid with the type of academic writing that we'll be using here. That's a good question, though. So, like, if you were writing an article for Army Times or something like that, that would be sort of a hybrid where you could probably get away with saying, like, hey, we've all been there, and you could describe, you know, something using more colloquial language. And with academic writing, you do want to have a more formal tone where you generally avoid that type of thing. For example, you want to avoid the use of first person. So that's the general rule of thumb there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I was just trying to figure out, like, is this class the more academic side, or should we, stay somewhat informal?
It's definitely more on the academic side. You can consider, you know, the first written assignment is a doctrinal exercise, basically. The second one is an argumentative essay that you definitely would just consider an academic style essay. Although there is one exception, that for the argument paper, you'll see that all three topics that you can choose from, we'll go over them, they're all topics where each and every one of you would be considered subject matter experts. So you can use your own personal experience. You can use the first person for the argumentative essay, not the mission command essay though. But with the argumentative essay, you can relate experiences that you've had that are relevant to the topic that you choose. And those topics will be either sharp, resilience, or leader development. Good question. Anybody else? Okay, great. All right, so go ahead and share the screen here. Now we're going to talk about organization. And this is a particularly important part. So I know we kind of covered a lot up front, and things are going to start to wind down a little bit, but it's really important that we devote our attention to the essay level and paragraph level organization because it's so important and often misunderstood. Now, who can tell me what we're looking at here? Is anyone familiar with this traditional graphic?
Yeah, it's like essay building.
What's that?
Essay building?
Yeah, it's essay building, and it's also known as the 5-paragraph essay template.
Yeah, what you learned in high school and junior high.
Exactly. That's what I was getting at. Is a lot of you probably saw this in high school or maybe even college as just a general template for how an essay should be set up. Now, I'm not hating on this template. There is great instructional value in understanding that your writing should have an introduction and that it should have body paragraphs and it should conclude effectively, right? So it's a useful template, but it can seem a little restrictive. It can seem a little prescriptive that, your essay has to have 5 paragraphs and 5 paragraphs alone. The reality is that with graduate level writing and professional writing, this is more like what that template would become, right? So you can see that you're still covering, maybe 3 main points. You could be covering more than 3, but what do we see that's different about the coverage of those points?
Each main point has supporting documentation as to why it's a main point.
Right. So those blocks, that's true, but also another key takeaway is that each one of those blocks represents a paragraph. So each main point can have more than 1 paragraph. So as you're covering the main points in your essay, you can have more than 1 paragraph that covers each main point versus this essay, which would say, hey, cram all of your points about this issue in paragraph number 1, and then cram everything into paragraph 2, etc. So this graphic is going to make more sense after we're going to come back to it. It'll make more sense after we review thesis statements, because thesis statements are often misunderstood, and it's super important that we have demystified thesis statements and understand exactly what they are. So with the introduction, however, there are some key takeaways. We'll talk more about effective introductions for your argumentative essays in the workshop for argument papers. But in general, we just want to remember that what does an introduction do? It doesn't go on and on. And also, it's not so brief as to leave us with no context, right? We want to do 3 main things in an introduction. And you can write these down, is to, number 1, grab the reader's attention in some way. And there are a number of techniques for doing that, whether it's a startling statistic, use of a narrative. There are a lot of techniques, and we'll talk more about that later. But ultimately, you want to, number 1, grab your reader's attention, provide context for what's to come, and then last but not least, give your thesis up front, meaning that your thesis is the end of the first paragraph. All right, so let's take a look at this sample thesis. We argue that reductions in the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal are strategically risky, signal weakness, and invite challenges from U.S. foes and worry among U.S. allies. So if we had to boil this down to just a few words, what is this author trying to argue?
It's saying that getting rid of nuclear weapons is dangerous for the United States.
Sorry, is what for the United States? That's bad for the United States, right?
Yes.
Exactly. So essentially, what that we can call that the main argument is that reductions are bad. What do we have in addition to that main argument in this thesis statement?
This Lieutenant Stokes, the points that he's going to cover throughout his essay?
Exactly. There is a list of the key points that will be covered in the essay. So with a thesis statement, we have a main argument, like we can see here, taking a clear stance that, hey, doing reductions in the arsenal of the United States, it's a bad move. But then we have reasons why, right? They're strategically risky. They signal weakness, all that we saw in that thesis. That's essentially laying out a roadmap that previews the main points of our argument, right? So let's back up now and look at this enhanced template for our possible organization for an essay. What that means is when we drop our thesis and we say that reductions in the nuclear arsenal are, number one, strategically risky, we can see that's our main point, number one. We can spend as many paragraphs as we want discussing strategic risk, right? And then the next key point, we can talk about how it shows weakness to our allies or causes worry with our allies. We can spend 2 or 3 paragraphs on that. So that's the key takeaway in terms of that graphic. It's just understanding that the thesis not only takes a clear stance, but lays out a roadmap of what's going to be covered in the paragraphs that follow. It's so important that we understand this. So when you write an argumentative essay, or when you write a mission command essay, you're going to have a main argument yourself, and you're going to have a list of key points that support that argument, and your paragraphs are going to cover those points one by one in order. So here's another example of a thesis statement. Drone strikes are ethical. Main argument, right? Now we see the roadmap for the paper. Because of their advantages in identifying the terrorist target, they also strike with precision, number 2, minimize risk to ground troops, number 3. So that leads us to another myth that thesis statements only need to be 1 sentence long, particularly if you're dealing with a nuanced topic, making a nuanced argument, or writing a longer paper. Your thesis statements for mission command, for example, I've seen excellent thesis statements that are 4 sentences long, because for your mission command paper, you're going to be arguing whether your commander was successful or not in 4 of the 7 mission command principles. I've seen students address in their thesis each one of the principles as it relates to the commander's success or failure in 1 sentence, and they've been great. Also, I've seen really effective thesis statements for mission command that have been only 1 sentence. So it really depends on what your argument is, who your commander is, how nuanced the analysis is of mission command as it relates to that conflict. That's something we're going to go far in depth with the mission command workshop. We're going to look at sample thesis statements that will help relieve your anxiety about, like, how the hell do I write a thesis statement for this particular essay? It's a challenging essay, right? Because it not only is it a research paper that's 6 to 8 pages, which you may have already done before in undergrad, so that in and of itself might not be super anxiety provoking, but also it's what that paper is a doctrinal analysis. Like, you are analyzing doctrine using research. So it's an interesting assignment, and I think it's something that's very valuable to students. But in terms of crafting a thesis statement and things like that, it might be a little overwhelming. That's why these workshops are here. We're going to go over sample paragraphs, sample thesis statements, so don't worry. The key takeaway for today is that a thesis takes a stance, lays out a roadmap of what the heck you're going to be talking about in your paper. We need to know that ahead of time. So, moving down to the last paragraph of our essay is a conclusion. Again, we'll talk more about specific strategies for the specific essays you'll be doing in the course, but ultimately, in general, a conclusion, as you may remember, it's going to restate your thesis in new words and summarize your main points, ending with some kind of so what statement. Again, more to follow on what the so what can be or should be for an essay. But for now, just imagine that you, with your conclusion, number 1, you're restating your thesis. And one key piece of advice that I would give, if you're having trouble developing your conclusion, restate your main argument and then devote 1 sentence each to the key points that you've covered. So if we use that nuclear arsenal example, you'd restate your main argument and then give a full sentence about the strategic risk element, and then the signaling weakness element. That helps to really develop a conclusion if you're having trouble developing it. And then the so what statement is really just, with your conclusion, you've looked back already at what you've covered, right? Big part of a conclusion is looking back at what you've already covered. The so what statement is looking forward. So it's like, what do we do from here? So you want to leave readers with something to think about, the so what of your essay. So again, we'll look at some more specific techniques for so what in the workshops that follow. You also find some in the writing resources folder, there are selected readings, and there's some great reading in there about effective conclusion writing as well. So I highly recommend that you read through that as soon as you're available. All right, so any questions on global organization of an essay? So we've covered what an introduction should do, what a conclusion should do, but what did we talk about earlier when we were talking about the substance of writing? We talked about evidence and analysis, right? And we see the evidence and analysis really play out the most in the body paragraphs. The bulk of your essay is body paragraphs, and that's where we come up with this technique that describes effective paragraph organization, acronym CER. There are many well-respected paragraph organization techniques. They all ask for the same thing. Again, this goes back to ancient rhetoric for making effective arguments. This particular acronym, CER, is the one that we are going to use for this course because it is very simple, very powerful, and it's very clean. It makes the most sense. It's by scholar Wayne Booth. But again, it has its roots in all the scholarship of logic, reasoning, writing, and composition. And it essentially requires that your paragraphs do the following to be effective. It's that your paragraph begins with a clear claim. This is an arguable statement that requires evidence to be proved. So if we take the example of the nuclear arsenal, our thesis is that reductions are bad because of point one, which was, I believe, strategic risk, right? So our first paragraph, body paragraph, is going to have a sentence that goes ahead and says something to the effect of, without question, reductions in the U.S. nuclear arsenal present a clear strategic risk to the citizens and the military of the U.S. Army, something like that, right? So we have a clear claim up front at the beginning of our paragraph. From there, what do we need to do? It's just going to be our opinion, right? Unless we do what? Unless we provide some evidence from a source, from a quotation, a summary, paraphrase, statistic. For the case of the argument essay, we can use from existing knowledge if we have expert information or experience on this topic. This evidence is going to help prove your claim. It elevates your claim as an opinion to an actual proper claim or piece of argument, right? Now, after we've provided evidence from sources, we can't just let those sources speak for us, right? In our real lives, we probably wouldn't feel good about having someone speak on our behalf, right? That's kind of weak. We wouldn't view ourselves that way. It's like, oh no, I have, my wife do my talking for me or something like that. Yeah. Like, we want to be strong in our writing. So when we invite other people, other sources into our paragraphs, we need to take control of that evidence that we've provided, and we do that by providing reasoning. All that means is we're explaining, hey, this statistic that I just brought in clearly demonstrates that it's strategically risky for us to reduce our nuclear arsenal. We can see it in the numbers. We can see it in this claim from the general that I just cited, right? So ultimately, the name of the game here for writing an effective paragraph is you start with a claim, you incorporate evidence, and then anytime you bring in a piece of evidence, you show your reasoning. And what is that? It's at the bottom of the slide. Your reasoning, simply stated, it describes the logic between the claim that you've made and the evidence. So in this case, again, describe how the evidence you presented demonstrates the strategic risk of reducing the U.S. nuclear arsenal, right? We can call this analysis as well. So reasoning is essentially analysis, but that is the CER method. I want to make one thing perfectly clear, though, about this CER method. It's not as though with this paragraph organization technique that you cram all your evidence into the middle of a paragraph and then all your reasoning at the end. No. The way that this works is that every time you bring in a piece of evidence, you then bring in reasoning. Then you can bring in more evidence, then you can do more reasoning. So the E and the R can repeat a number of times within a paragraph. And we're going to look at a sample that's color-coded according to this color scheme that we have right here that demonstrates that. So you don't need to have all your evidence crammed in the middle. The key is that you make a claim, you back it up with a piece of evidence, you explain the connection between that evidence and your claim, you make that explicit with your own words, then you're allowed to bring in another piece of evidence to back up your claim, then you need to unpack that too. So any questions on that? This is probably the single most important thing to understand to do well, because I think most folks already have either a pretty good general understanding of introductions, conclusions, and thesis statements, or even an advanced understanding, but paragraphs can be a little mysterious. We want to have, using a technique like this forces us to have full accountability, where there's no fluff in our paragraphs. We're not just going to have a random background paragraph that's, not required for the essay, where it's just taking up space. Any questions? Quick look at the chat. All right, no questions. So now we'll look at this in action. All right, so we can see here, I won't insult anyone's intelligence. We know the claim comes first, right? So for this example, we can see that the claim turns blue. In general, members of the U.S. Army tend to have a self-image that bristles or does not like any hint of dishonesty, right? Members of the U.S. Army have a self-image of honesty and integrity, and rightfully so in almost every case, right? Now, that's just your opinion until you do what? You got to bring in some source material. So we can see that's where we have evidence, and it turns red here. You can see, according to a recent survey completed by over 20,000 members of the U.S. Army, 93% believe the Army values of etc. line up well with their own personal values, right? So far we're off to a great start. We've got a clear claim and some evidence to support that claim. Now, I want everyone to make a note of that small number 11 at the end of the sentence that's just turned red. That is what we will call an end note. It's also called a footnote, but for our purposes with this university, we use the Chicago Turabian style. If you've not used it before, don't panic. Many of you, I'm sure, have used MLA or APA. I've had to learn all the formats through my career. They all essentially ask for the same information. The one difference here is that with the Chicago Turabian style, rather than having a parenthetical citation, which you probably remember if you've done APA or MLA, at the end of this sentence that we just saw here, you'd have the author's last name in parentheses, a comma, and either the date, if it's APA or MLA, you'd have the page number, right? So the Chicago people don't like having their paragraphs mucked up with all that information, so they use footnotes. However, what we use in Chicago Turabian style are it's called end notes. We'll discuss the specifics there, and it's nothing you need to memorize. I just want you guys to leave this course with an understanding of what Chicago Turabian means, because it's kind of a noggin scratcher where it's like, wait, what the heck is Chicago Turabian style, and why the hell are we using it? The reason why is because there are basically three main styles, APA, MLA, and Chicago is a great style. Chicago Turabian refers to the Chicago style that is used in graduate schools for people who are writing theses dissertations, and so forth. So it's essentially Chicago style for people who are in school rather than Chicago style proper, which is used in professional writing. So more on that to follow, but for now, just make a note of that number 11. That's how you will give credit to your sources in order through your paper, is by using those superscript numbers. We'll talk more about that soon. For now, we want to focus on this paragraph organization where we've got a clear claim, we've got evidence to support it, and what's our job now is to explain that piece of evidence and how it relates to our main claim. So this writer has unpacked that survey by saying this self-confidence and the trustworthiness of America's warriors is mirrored externally by American society, right? So that makes sense. And this is where I was talking about how you can bring in more evidence. You don't have to cram all your evidence in at once. We can see now there's another sentence where we can see a Harris poll has been brought out where it says that military leaders have topped the list in this poll, where 55% of Americans report that they have a great deal of confidence in military leaders. Now, let's say that this sentence were slightly different, where we didn't know that military leaders were at the top of this list, and we just heard the statistic that, like, hey, dudes, guess what? 55% of Americans, according to a recent study, say they have high faith in America's Army leaders. How would we feel about that if we didn't have the context that that was at the top of the list? We probably feel like that, wait, that doesn't seem very high. It seems like that should be higher, right? So that's a key example of why we need to do the following, which is have a follow-up reasoning statement where we unpack that statistic and let readers know how it connects to our main claim. Now, this is the last thing I want to mention, and it's really important, is that when you end a paragraph, you always want to end a paragraph with reasoning, right? Because if you end a paragraph with source material or letting somebody else have the last word, you also haven't done the work of unpacking the source material that you've brought in. Furthermore, a great way to end a paragraph is to echo the claim that you've made. And why wouldn't you? Wouldn't you want to remind readers of what point you were trying to make to begin with? So let's look at this final reasoning statement and then review the main claim. And notice how they're very similar. So, with such a strong self-image and the reinforcing perspective of mostly adoring American society, it's not surprising that military leaders respond with indignation at any whiff of deceit concerning directed training compliance. Now, we go back to the top claim. In general, most members of the U.S. Army tend to have a self-image that bristles at any hint of dishonesty. Do we see how that last sentence essentially takes that main claim and allows it to blossom into something that's well-developed and well-supported, and essentially kind of goes over the main points that we brought up in the paragraph itself? So the key takeaway here is just that you want to echo your main claim at the end of your paragraph, and hopefully that echo is informed by the source material that you've made, and this is an elegant example of how you can do that. So we're going to look at more sample paragraphs, just like I said, for the argument paper and the mission command paper in the workshops. But for now, the key takeaway is that you need to have a main claim up front. You need to have about a 50-50 balance of source material and your own original thought where you unpack that source material. And you always want to end a paragraph with reasoning that backs up your main claim for that paragraph. And then you've got full accountability. And I find a lot of students find it to be helpful to actually color code their paragraphs, not to submit, but just as a tool for composition. So any questions on this? All right, great. Excellent. All right, so now, last tip, paragraph length. Oops. Last tip, this is a commonly asked question. How long should our paragraphs be? For essays of this length, you can use the general rule of thumb that you want about 1/2 to 3/4 of a double-spaced page. One thing also to note is all of your essays, all of your written assignments, you're going to use Arial font, 12-point Arial font. Paragraphs should be about 1/2 to 3/4 of a double-spaced page. Also, please, please, please do not forget this. When you submit your work to Blackboard, submit it as a Word document. I can't edit PDFs with track changes and comments. So I understand that some people submit as PDFs so that there's nothing lost in translation between different versions of Word. Don't worry about that. If something looks messed up, I'll contact you, but I've never had that happen. So please do not submit PDFs, because it just creates a headache for me where I have to contact the SGL to contact you to send it back. It disrupts the flow. So submit in Microsoft Word. All right, so now we've covered the first 2 categories of the rubric, and those are the ones that I think are most important to go far in depth with. Now, the last 2 I think are pretty intuitive: style and correctness. So for style, the way that what you're going to be evaluated on is your adherence to those key points that we talked about regarding AR 25-50, understandable in a single rapid reading. Again, read your work out loud. That's the number one way to get to the point where you'll be sure that it's easily understandable. Also, using a precise, concise, appropriate tone. Active voice predominates. Make sure that your formatting is on target, and that means formatting in terms of using Arial 12-point font, using Chicago Turabian style citations, appropriate use of quotations and paraphrases, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So we want to take a look at plagiarism. This is super important. I have seen some really ugly things go down. ALU takes plagiarism understandably deadly serious. It's not something to do. Trust me, it is not worth it. You will get caught. I've seen it happen all too many times. And you can ultimately, I've seen people get kicked out of the Army for it. Not even just having to retake the class, recycle. It's just don't do it. So that means don't present someone else's ideas, words, or data as your own. So as a result of some of the claims that people who have plagiarized in the past, I do have to mention some things that should be obvious. Direct quotations. You obviously need to use quotation marks if you're using a source word for word. If you don't use direct quotation marks and you've quoted something directly, that's academically dishonest. Why? Because it's basically indicating that you've put it into your own words, right? So you need to put it in your own words or use direct quotation marks. That being said, one thing to jot down that's super important is to use direct quotations sparingly. Paraphrase instead. Paraphrasing increases the originality and flow of your writing. It also demonstrates your mastery of the material. If you use a direct quotation, there should be a reason why. Like if it's a direct quotation from your commander on the ground in the mission command paper that you're using. You have to ask yourself, am I using this direct quotation because it's easy? Because it's probably better if I paraphrase it, put in my own words, and then use an endnote. So citations are not necessary just for direct quotations. Obviously, you have to use them for when you paraphrase from an outside source or if you summarize something from an outside source. Ultimately, any borrowed direct language or borrowed ideas from other sources need to be quoted. Need to be cited. All right, so plagiarism at ALU, there are some specific definitions here. Use of previous student work, and this is the big one that gets people in trouble. possession of previous student work. If you've got a buddy who's done this course before, trust me, if you got that paper on your computer, delete it now, because possession of that constitutes plagiarism, even just to see what right looks like. If you're like, you have a friend who did the course and you're like, hey, how'd you do on the mission command essay? I did pretty well. Here, you can take a look at it. This has happened where someone did a completely different essay, but they had looked at someone else's previous product and they failed the assignment. So keep that in mind. Also, safe assign is incorporated into Blackboard, which means that if your paper or part of your paper has been submitted before, it's going to be caught automatically, and it's very obvious to us writing instructors when that's the case. So any questions, feel free to turn on your microphones. It's a little easier for me to do that rather than to toggle back to the chat. Any questions on plagiarism? All right. If there's no questions there, we're going to take a closer look at Chicago Turabian style. Now, we saw earlier the big difference between APA, MLA, and Chicago, and that is that Chicago doesn't use in-text citations. It uses endnotes, right? And those are little numbers that direct you to what? An endnotes page. So what you see on the screen right now represents the last 2 pages of your essays. You don't need to worry about this for the info paper, more on that to follow. But for your argument essay and your mission command essay, last 2 pages of your essay are going to have an endnotes page and a bibliography page. So the endnotes page is going to show what the numbers that you've used in your paragraphs, what do they track to? What sources do they track to? So the first time you use a source, that source is going to be listed first on the endnotes page. And you can see here, and you can refer back to this, you don't need to memorize it. This is what goes on your endnotes entry if it's a book. Now, we've gone ahead and filled in that template just with the bibliographic information for this actual manual for Chicago Turabian style, right? But this represents our sources used in order throughout the paper. And on the bibliography page, you can see it's very similar to what you're used to with a references page for APA, or for MLA, what's called a works cited page, pretty much the same information. And you can see a sample filled out there. Again, you do not need to memorize this. There's also a document in the English Writing Help folder called Chicago Turabian Style Citations. It's only a page and a half, has all the templates you need to execute these citations when it comes time to write your endnotes and bibliography pages. Now for an article, you can see a template there. Again, one thing to note here on the endnotes page, note the indentation conventions. You've got the first line indented, the line after it is not indented. Also for articles, they go in quotation marks, whereas books are italicized. Also, if you mention a book in the body of your paper, it's italicized. Journal articles are in quotation marks. And we can see here that's just a sample article that we filled out the template with. Now, this is as tricky as it gets with Chicago Turabian style, is let's say that Kate Turabian is an author in our paper. So again, endnotes page is a sequential list of the sources that we've used as we've used them. You'll never see the same number twice in your paper. As you go through your paper, you're going to see number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. It's going to keep going on down the line. So what happens if we have an author and her name's Kate Turabian and we use her source again? We don't need to fill out all that information again that we did with entry number 2. We just use her last name, comma, and page number. And now, wait a second, this endnotes page is starting to look a heck of a lot like what? A heck of a lot like the type of parenthetical or in-text citations that we would have used if we were using MLA or APA, right? So this is just how Chicago style does it. You could argue that it's a little redundant that the endnotes page has to have all this additional information the first time we see the book, right, or the article. But anytime you use that book or article thereafter, you're just listing the author's last name and the page number. Likewise, if we used Ulrich's article after as the sixth use of a source in our paper, we'd simply have Ulrich, 87. Now, this is where it gets a little trickier, and it's just the word ibid, which you've probably seen in books before, and it's short for ibidem, the Latin for in the same place. You can think of ibid as simply see above. So in the case of Ulrich here, what would we gather? Can anyone take a guess what these last two entries imply? What does 7 and 8, what do they represent? What do they imply in terms of who we've used and what page?
You used Ulrich 2 more times?
Exactly. We used Ulrich 2 more times sequentially. So we use ibid anytime we use Ulrich or any other author twice in a row. Now, we can see it says ibid 98 the first time. Now, then it just says ibid. So the very last one indicates that it's the same author in the same page. That is the most complicated scenario you're going to find yourself in. And you're not going to fail the paper if your ibid game isn't totally dialed in. But ultimately, it's sort of intuitive. And ultimately, you don't need to memorize this. You just need to go to the resources that you have, refer to them, and you'll be good to go. So any questions on the basics of the Chicago Turabian style? Again, this represents the last 2 pages of your paper. And basically, it's going to look like this.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure, go right ahead.
What would you do if you had this same author but different either articles or books? How would you cite it again if you already cited it once?
Very good question, and that does happen somewhat regularly. So let's say that we had Kate Turabian, and she, let's say we have 2 books by her. All you'd need to do is for number 5, the second time you brought Kate Turabian in, you would have Turabian, comma, and then the title of the book, and then another comma, and then the page number. So if you have multiple works by a single author, the only thing that changes is you need to include the title of the work plus the page number. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Good question.
Hey, sir. So this is Captain Seaman. I just have a quick question.
Sure.
You may know something more off of Microsoft Word. So in references, when you can build your style for citations, there's a Turabian 6th edition and a Chicago 16th edition. Any chance that you have any feedback on which one of those would be ideal to build our products with?
Yes, thank you so much for asking that question. So ever since I've been here at ALU, Microsoft Word, unless they have made a new update that I don't know about, their automated Turabian and Chicago style, well, I don't know about the Chicago style, but their automated Turabian style does not work correctly. It tries to treat the endnotes as footnotes. So what you'll wind up with when you use the Word's automated feature to do endnotes is you'll wind up with a black line at the end of every page, and your endnotes, or what will look like footnotes on each individual page, when we don't want that. We want the pages to be clean all the way through the essay, and then just an endnotes page at the end. So the guidance, and again, I'm so glad you asked this, the guidance for that is in the English Writing Resources folder, where you will see a document entitled Formatting Tips. And you'll see that in that document, there's a section about how it's highly recommended that you format your endnotes manually, and it tells you exactly how to do it manually, where you just insert your own superscript number and then construct the endnotes page on your own. So not necessarily ideal. I don't know how in the world Microsoft Word got it wrong, but that continues to be a problem, and I've seen students have issues with that. It just creates greater frustration. So we're not trying to make anyone's life harder. Quite the contrary. We include that information so that you don't wind up with this headache and this mess of footnotes where there should be endnotes. So go ahead and incorporate them manually. And a secondary tip that I'd have is that it can be troublesome where if you go through and you start making all these superscript numbers and you're like, wait, I want to incorporate a new source. Now I got to change all the damn numbers. What I see a lot of students do is when they're drafting, they'll just use their own style of choice, like APA or MLA, or just have the author's last name and the page number, whatever it is, just as a placeholder, and then they put the endnotes in at the end as the final polish. That's not a bad way to do it. Any other questions? And for what it's worth, if you're kind of like, good God, why do we have to do this? For other things that you're going to have to do, like CGSC, it's used in the Army War College. There's some connection between AR 25-50 and Chicago, and I've tried to track it down with some soft research a couple of times as to why. But that is what is used for other things, that ILE, whatever. I've heard that that's what they use there too. So you will be using it again. This is not like a waste of your time to learn a new style. Sorry, is that a question? I think I heard something there. Or somebody's got their mic on, I guess. Make sure your mics are on. All right, so that's the gist of things. These are my quick takeaways for where students wind up some points for their endnotes and bibliography. Very simple. Look at the endnotes page. The first line is indented. The second line is not. Just scroll down that endnotes page. You can see. Entry number 6, for example, indentation, then the number, then the author, then the lines that follow. They're not indented, just like a regular paragraph, right? Bibliography, you should notice the hanging indentations here, right? No excuse not to know this because APA and MLA both use hanging indentations. So those are two little things where you can not earn the full style points. Again, we're talking about the style category of the rubric. So I know that is not an exciting topic, the Chicago Turabian style citations. Again, key takeaway, you can look up the answers to your questions as you go. I am also here as a resource to help you with problematic citations that you run into that you can't figure out with the guides that we have in the Writing Help folder. All right, so that's style. Now, the last thing here is the easiest to cover, correctness, very self-explanatory, making sure that your spelling, grammar, punctuation, capitalization. By the way, you can use the standard capitalization guidance for Army, where, you know, like soldiers being capitalized, if they're U.S. soldiers and that sort of thing. You can do that. There's no issue with that. Also, yes, be sure to refer to the writing resources folder because there's some reading in there about sentence mechanics, more on citation and formatting. I promise it won't take long to go through all of the materials in there. Just get eyes on everything in that folder. That will prevent you from making mistakes that could wind up costing you huge points. It won't take long. I know you guys have lots of other stuff to do, but between the mission command paper and the brief, which the brief is impossible without having done the paper, in my personal opinion, that both of those are worth 100 points. So it's worth it to, you know, really take the writing thing seriously. One little thing that is important that you'll see, just as an example of some of the stuff in the writing resources folder that you may not know, is that the Oxford or serial comma is absolutely what you want to use. This is a common comma mistake. This is just one example of the kind of stuff you'll see in there. So an incorrect way to make a list, like a cereal list of things, would be like, I love to eat eggs, toast, and cereal. There has to be a comma between toast and the word and. Otherwise, we think toast and cereal are the same thing. Like toast and cereal is like peanut butter and jelly. No, you have to have a comma there. The only style that has where you'll be like, wait, I've seen people make a list of items like that where there's no comma. Well, they were either wrong or they were using what's called AP or Associated Press style. And in that style, they would omit that serial comma or Oxford comma because it would save print space for their printing for a newspaper or a magazine. And you'll still see it sometimes in articles, even on sites, that news sites and things like that. But in terms of real writing, you should have a serial comma, and that means a comma between any list. When you're doing a list of more than 2 items, there should always be a comma before the last one. All right, so now we've covered the main categories of the rubric. Again, this tracks back to the definition of effective Army writing: easily understandable, single, rapid reading, free of errors in what? Substance, organization, style, and correctness. Couple of quick heads up items from the handbook. You don't need to read through all of this. The main thing is that don't be late with your submission. All the submissions are due at 09. Well, I'll show the due dates in a minute. You should have access to them. Actually, I'll just tell them to you now. The information paper is due 09, 30 April, Thursday. That's when your info papers are due. Your argument paper is due 09, all submitted to Blackboard, 09 on 7 May. And your mission command paper is due... I don't have that in my planner yet. Oh, wait, no, here it is. It's due 15 May, Friday. So make sure you're tracking those dates. And the reason why is if you're late, the late penalty here is pretty severe. You get 70% of the raw score. So if you're late and you got 100% on the mission command paper, it's times 0.7, you get a 70. Now, that seems harsh, but at the same time, I'm old school. I'm told often that I look younger than I am, but I'm 42, and when I was at the University of Virginia, you could submit work late for a 0. Like, there was no late work policy, ever. Didn't matter. If you were late, you got a 0. So it does seem stringent, but work ahead. And if you have a problem submitting via Blackboard, what you need to do is just email the paper to your SGL so it has a timestamp on it, and then there's no stress. So you don't need to have any anxiety about that. So keep that in mind.
I got a question. Are those the same dates that are on the 2404 Excel calendar that you just read off?
Yes, they should be. If there's any discrepancy, please let me know. Are you seeing a discrepancy?
No, I haven't looked at it yet, but I just wanted to make sure that was the same dates you read off of, because then it's easy.
Yeah, that calendar, the calendar that you described, should be 100% correct. So the dates that I mentioned are based off the latest calendar that I got. So if you see something different, just email me or your SGL, and we'll make sure that everybody's tracking the correct date. But those, as far as I know, those are 100% correct. So key thing is don't submit late. And number 2, don't get below a 70, because if you get below a 70, you keep that failing score and you have to redo the assignment to standard, which means you have to do the assignment to the standard of 70 or greater. So I don't want to create any more work for you guys than is necessary. So just make sure that you're putting your best foot forward with your assignments. So I just wanted to make sure nobody got blindsided by those 2 things from the student handbook. All right, any questions before we before we wrap up by looking at the first 2 assignments for this course? We won't discuss mission command in this block of instruction because you're going to have a block of instruction later on the actual doctrine. So we discussed mission command papers in the mission command workshop. All right, so for the information paper, your prompt is the following. You're imagining that your battalion commander has asked you to summarize a piece of doctrine for him or her in a one-page information paper so that he or she can save some time. So choose one of the following selections of doctrine to summarize in accordance with the Army writing style and the provided formatting examples. So, long story short, all you're doing is you're imagining that your battalion commander has told you, hey, take a look at this doctrine. I want you to summarize it into a one-page and no longer than one-page information paper so that I can save time or disseminate the key points of this piece of doctrine to everyone so that they're all tracking, they're all on the same page. So you can pick from any of these three: leader development, resiliency, sexual harassment, assault response, and prevention. You'll note here that these are selections from the doctrine, right? For example, number 1, you're not summarizing all of 6-22, it's chapter 1. Likewise, for resilience, you're only summarizing selected sections, okay? So all of those readings are in your English, or I believe they're still in the writing resources folder. There may have been a move to remove them because updates were happening to doctrine at the time. Regardless, just make sure that you're tracking which sections you're actually summarizing. You're not summarizing the whole piece of doctrine. You're summarizing specified sections. So this is directly from the instructions, which you can find at the top of the rubric. Key takeaways are in bold here. Information paper can't be longer than a page, okay? Also, no direct quotations. Everything needs to be in your own words, and it's worth 20 points. So you're translating it into your own words. Now, this is the information paper format. You can see here in the English resources folder, you're going to find 2 sample information papers, and they both serve as guidance, not just as a sample, but the information papers themselves describe how to format an information paper. So it's kind of a meta thing where it's an information paper about how to write an information paper. So look at that example over here. You can see where it says subject, information paper format, purpose to provide guidance on how to prepare and use an information paper. Then it has a list of facts about information paper format, which also guide you as to how you should approach this format. But you can see it's basically just a list of facts. So what's the point of this assignment? It's to make sure that you, as a future commander, can effectively summarize in your own words in a clear and concise way a longer piece of doctrine into something that is more concise. And that shows that you can follow instructions in terms of making sure that it's formatted properly. So just to give you a quick sort of heads up, giving you some answers, basically. At the top right of your document, instead of the office symbol would not be ATCS-XS, it would simply be log C3. And you'll see that in the additional information paper guidance. It's a Word document, and it's the sample that the writing department has put together. And I highly advise that you use that as a template and just put your own information into that paper. So make sure you find that. So for information paper, my most important piece of advice is find the sample information paper that's the Word document version. The one you're looking at now is the PDF version that's actually from TR1-11 that serves as the doctrinal sample. The sample that we've put together you can actually use as a template to fill in your information. So for the subject of your information paper, you're going to simply put in the subject of what you're covering. It would be, let's use leader development. Your subject would be leader development. Now, what would your purpose be? Your purpose, I'll give you the answer, is to summarize. And what are you summarizing? ADP 6-22? No. You would be to summarize Chapter 1, the Army Profession Ethic Leadership from ADP. You can basically copy and paste this part from the instructions to summarize Chapter 1, etc. Right? So that makes it easy. And it also makes it more precise, because if you said your purpose was to summarize 6-22, that would be incorrect because you're not summarizing the whole thing. You're only doing Chapter 1. So hopefully that helps get you off to a good start with that paper. Shouldn't take you a long time, but email me with questions on that. Or if you have questions now, just chime in anytime. And here you can see a screenshot of the Word document that you'll have available in your folder that we put together in the writing department. And you can see it's got that log C3 at the top, and at the bottom, you'll have your name, fake phone number, and then approved by with a blank line. That's where you have blank line there. So that's, and it talks about using subpoints. You can miss stuff if you don't read through both these samples, like no fact should be longer than 5 lines to ensure concision. That's word for word from this particular document. So helpful resources, bottom line there, are in that folder. All right. So the argument paper, again, we're going to have a full workshop on this. So we'll just cover the basics for now, just so you're tracking what the general thrust of the assignment is. It's a 2 to 4 page paper, not including the title page or endnotes page. This is the first assignment where you have to have Chicago Turabian style incorporated, right? Again, before I forget, there is a sample paper for formatting. It's a formatting example for argument and mission command. That's the title of the document. Again, make sure you get eyes on everything in the folder. It'll walk you through everything. But you're going to write an argument paper where you identify and demonstrate a weakness in any of the following: Army Leader Development Program, same topics as the info paper, resilience or SHARP. Then argue for 3 solutions to that specified weakness. All right, so again, that's the main prompt. Additional research to the assigned readings is encouraged but not required. Obviously, you need to provide concrete evidence, the same way we talked about paragraphs and evidence to support your claims. 2 to 4 pages, endnotes page, bibliography. You need to have at least 2 sources. So you want to make sure you read through the instructions fully. But the main thing I want to get across here, let me back up, is I want to sort of give you the answers here a little bit in terms of what am I supposed to do based on the instructions here. So check this out. We talked about thesis statements and key points, right? So I'm going to read through the instructions, and I want everyone to take special note. I'm going to add some words to the instructions where it tells you exactly where things should go. All right, so starting from the top, construct a 2 to 4 page argument paper. In the introduction, you will identify and demonstrate one weakness in any of these 3 things. Then in your thesis statement, argue for 3 solutions for that specified weakness, okay? And for each paragraph, you'll cover 1 solution, but one by one. You can have more than 1 paragraph for each solution. And in those paragraphs, you need to consider the following in your evidence and in your analysis. Your paragraphs should cover how to implement your solution. B, costs and resources needed. C, where applicable, counter arguments. Hopefully that lets you know you have exactly what you need to know for the essay in those instructions. And hopefully what I did helps you understand, like, oh, okay, this is exactly where stuff needs to go. You're not writing a paper about 3 weaknesses. You're not going to talk about the weaknesses in your body paragraphs. You're identifying and demonstrating one weakness as the introduction to your paper, where you then drop a thesis statement with 3 solutions to that weakness. And then in your paragraphs that follow, you're going to say, here's solution 1. And then those paragraphs will address A, B, and C. How to implement it, costs, resources needed, and where applicable, counter arguments. So hopefully that's helpful. We'll talk more about that in the workshop. But this is essentially what your end product is going to look like. You're going to have a cover page. Again, there's a sample formatting example where you can fill in your information for the cover page, about 2 to 4 pages of actual writing, and then an endnotes page and a bibliography page. So any questions on the argument paper or anything else we've covered so far.
For the argument paper, can we choose a different topic?
You can email me about it. Well, actually, ask me now if you're comfortable. What did you have something specific you wanted to cover?
Height and weight standards.
Height and weight standards. Yeah, if you want, go ahead and shoot me an email. I'll have my email available at the slide at the end. That sounds like that might be a cool topic. You just need to make sure that you have to have some doctrine that you're basing it off of, right? And I know that will be available. So just give me an idea of remind me of what your topic is and what you're thinking your potential thesis might be. I don't expect you to know exactly what your thesis is without having done the research and all that yet. But that sounds like an interesting example of something that could be good. Good question. Anybody else?
Can you pick the same subject for both information and argument paper?
Absolutely. And to a certain extent, I encourage that because remember, you have to have at least two sources. And if let's say that you chose Army Leader Development for your info paper and your argument paper, you can actually use the doctrine that you summarize, that piece of doctrine that you already summarized in the info paper. You can use that in the argument paper too if you want to include some information from the doctrine in the argument paper. So you could use that. And then there are suggested readings for the argument paper. Did I skip right over that? I think I did. Yeah, you can see here, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this. Based on your topic for the argument paper, you're going to consult these following readings for inspiration. This is important. Note that you're not required to argue with the reading itself. You don't even have to cite it. You're simply using it for context, but you can cite it. So this is an awesome article, actually, Wenzel's article on developing leaders from military review. So look, just stick with leader development for now. If you did, to answer your question, if you did leader development, you could use the doctrine as one of your sources. You could also use the leader development from Wenzel's article. You could use that as a source too. So then you'd have at least two sources without any further research, although further research is encouraged. Good question so far. Anybody else? All right. So mission command paper, again, I would recommend reading ahead if time permits. At least the first chapter of 6-0, ADP 6-0. You've already selected your historic battle and commander. Just as a quick heads up, what you're going to be doing for the paper and for the brief is you're going to be evaluating your commander's performance in terms of the 7 principles of mission command doctrine. And ultimately what your paper is going to be about is a doctrinal analysis of you evaluating whether the commander was successful through the lens of this modern U.S. Army doctrine, right? It's not about whether the commander was successful in the actual battle so much as whether they were exhibiting the principles of mission command, right? So there will be a writing workshop on mission command papers. I've got that scheduled, I think, on the next slide here. Oh, okay. I've already mentioned the writing resources folder like a million times, so I don't want to be too annoying with that. Just remember that it's available through Blackboard, and I also made sure that it will be sent to you by your SGL so that you can just save it to your desktop, because sometimes access issues do happen. So just having it on your desktop as a zip file, or just having it as a folder, go through all of the material in there. You're going to find all the rubrics in there and really concise resources that will help prevent problems that could really get you into trouble or waste your time. The point of the writing resources folder is truly to save time and help you do the best work possible. I promise you that. There's no fluff in there. And the only homework that I would recommend is make sure you review that resources folder. Just get eyes on everything after this block of instruction, and come see me during office hours with questions. All right, so I already mentioned these due dates. Feel free to screenshot them if you don't already have the calendar. Sounds like you guys do have the calendar already, so Those are our due dates. I thought I had the workshop. All right, let me back up. Let me give you the workshop dates. I think those are on the calendar as well, but I'll just mention them now. The argument paper workshop is on 4 May, Monday at noon. More information to follow on whether we'll be meeting in Teams or Zoom. It'll probably be Teams, but we'll make sure we get that information out to you ASAP. Then we'll have the Mission Command workshop the following Monday, 11 May, and that'll be at noon as well. I think that they're really important, those workshops, so I highly recommend that you do attend. All right, so here's my contact information. You can see I don't have access to my regular enterprise email, so you're just going to be using my personal email. Office hours are 11 to 1300, and I'm going to try to be as flexible as possible to do office hours when it's convenient because everything's so crazy right now, but please do be respectful of my time on the weekends. And yeah, so the main guidance is Monday through Friday, 11 to 1300 is when you can reach me. And let's talk a little bit about how we will run office hours, given that we don't have a physical office. I'm going to continue to try to optimize the situation, but for now, you can just start by sending me an email if that's easiest. So if you want a quick response to a quick question, just send me an email and I can respond. If it's more complex, or if you simply want to speak with me, 100%, it is not like I am here to help. We can easily do a phone conference or a Zoom meeting during that time. So the key is just to start with an email and either say, here's my quick question, or hey, can we do a Zoom conference? That being said, I am working towards a concept where there would be a Zoom meeting scheduled every day that I could disseminate to the SGLs and they could share that link. And then it would just be an open Zoom meeting where people could join. But the key is I want to make sure people have privacy so that I think there's a way to have people in a queue so I can finish with one person in the Zoom conference and then hang up with them and then move on to the next person. So more to follow on that. I'll be working on that this weekend with my colleague in writing, Mr. Stacy. So that's what we're gonna take it one step at a time, but the main lifeline for now is going to be email, let me know what's going on, and we can work from there. Now, for office hours, some important things. I'm going to be able to help you with any specific part of your paper, but I'm not going to read the paper in its entirety and tell you how to fix it. The writing instructors are not permitted to proofread your work. You can trade papers with each other and give each other guidance on that, but you can't. This is not like a paper submission service. You have to come with specific questions like, hey, I've started my argument paper. Here's my introduction. What do you think about the thesis? Or what do you think about the introduction? Or you can ask any question like, hey, I've got a draft. Can you look at my organization? Does the organization look good? And yeah, I might wind up reading the whole paper, but you cannot just email me your paper and say, can you check this out? Because I will not. I will say, what are your questions? Or let's get on the phone. So yeah, that would essentially be asking me to your paper due. That's not going to happen. So try not to wait till the day before the paper's due because, and this is not for me that you don't wait till the day the paper's due, it's for you because in previous terms, when people wait till the day before, I've seen lines literally out the door where students have had to wait over an hour and a half to get their question answered because so many people come the last day. So the same thing's going to be true with virtual office hours. So try to work ahead and come early with your questions to office hours, and that's I'm waiting. So any questions at all about what we've covered? I know we covered a lot today, and I hope that it was helpful in terms of helping everyone to understand what is expected of you for these specific assignments moving forward. But that's all I have if you don't have any questions.